Why read one detective story when you could have 8? Coming in 5th place on review season for our 2023 recommendations is Alex Pavesi with his debut mystery novel, 8 Detectives. Released in 2020, the novel takes Alex's background in mathematics and questions the numerical principles that define the genre. Except, that's not quite the whole story. After a short story of a betrayal in a Spanish mansion, we're introduced to Grant McAllister and Julia Hart, an author and editor, in conversation over that same tale of betrayal. Julia has come to meet with Grant to discuss a collection of short stories the author wrote. In a previous life, he was a professor of mathematics and an author of a paper that establishes the key conditions for murder mystery to be an applicable definition. How many suspects, perpetrators, victims, and crimes in what combination do you need to sculpt the genre? In his collection, The White Murders, which the pair are discussing, he demonstrates these permutations to bizarre effect. Reading 8 Detectives is to read both layers of reality. First, you read one of the various short stories in Grant's collection, and then follow his discussion on the subject with Julia. As you get further through, Julia notes more and more inconsistencies, both within the short stories and in Grant's testimonies. You wonder, what do Grant's choices in this fiction mean, and how does it connect to our overall mystery? Soon, you also find yourself suspicious of Julia. Why travel all the way to a small island to meet with an author of a series of nonsensical mysteries? Perhaps most disturbing of all, why is it that Grant's stories echo the disappearance of a girl named Elizabeth White some years ago? Alex Pavesi manages masterfully to make each story both engaging and nonsensical. The sun switches sides of a house, wine is black, and characters disapparate for pages at a time. The very G.K. Chesterton-style paradoxical magical realism of intentionally skewed writing creates atmospheres many modern mysteries eschew because they just don't make enough sense. But there's always a method to the madness. Each has their own set of mystery questions, with a healthy dose of horror-esque unreality and gruesome disturbance. Every time, the nature of detectives and the core criteria for what is detective fiction is pushed to its limits. Perhaps strangest of all, it achieves these seemingly lofty goals whilst you almost forget that it does. But for one final hurdle, 8 Detectives makes metafiction seem so much easier to read than many other stories within stories ever achieve. The key challenge that Pavesi set for himself in the structure of this story is that neither Julia or Grant garner the position of a lead character to sink your investment into the story. Their puzzles and discussions are interesting, and they are well-developed characters through their relationship to the short stories, but you might not find yourself incredibly attached to them by the end of the novel. Instead, 8 Detectives relies on the quizzicality of its own absurdity to get you curious. Where many mystery metafictions deconstruct how distant the audience is able to become from the suffering of the cast, 8 Detectives instead exaggerates this separation. The characters in both the meta-narrative and the short stories become so built upon curiosity that the human moments are almost twists, which in the strangest way really works for the story. Pavesi clearly knows it too, because there is one short story that builds that play to its logical extreme, and it's a thorough pause for thought. Pavesi's curiosity with why we write stories, and through that, his inspiration in Death and the Seaside, our 12th place entry this review season, shine. When we think of fiction as mathematical obligations, where does narrative even belong? The mathematics Grant uses to sculpt his short stories would seem too emotionless to have posed so many unsettling situations. Alex may not have actually written Grant's Permutations of Detective Fiction research paper, but he's definitely written a course in applying it. When you boil down the world to statements that are true by construction, beauty emerges from the application, whether you intend it or not. Whether Grant and Julia's story, or the short stories themselves, is the real book of 8 Detectives is something you will decide for yourself upon reading the novel. You may find one side or the other of this reality a tad too burdened with tropes and predictable twists, but they rarely get in the way of the fun or the insights. Sometimes a twist is predictable because it says something by being so. Of course, because it is metafiction, regardless of which you decide to be the meat, you can't leave the bones behind. However you take it, Alex Pavesi has presented a masterclass in how to understand the fundamentals of writing and their impact on the stories we read. Poking holes in your own story in a way that doesn't feel contrived takes mathematical precision and artistic nuance, which are impressive to see on the page at the same time. Eight Detectives takes out 5th place on review season 2023 for Death of the Reader. Thank you to Alex for joining us on the show to take such a delightful deep dive into his motivations behind the story and how distinct his own reading of his work was from our typical structure on the show. The book is out with Penguin Australia. You're listening to your Murder Mystery World Tour on 2SER 107.3.